Well, I'm now joined by an interesting person with me right now who is in India and experiencing all vibrant colors of India, diversity of India. Well, yes, I'm talking about Mr. Salvatore Babones, the Sydney professor and sociologist with me. He's in India, he's in national capital right now. This is something very interesting. Someone coming from West and absorbing all different colors that India has. Your very first reaction of you entering country India?
Oh, my very first reaction of India is, wow, the samosas are great here. When I first landed in India, I first had a samosa on my first trip. Second trip to India, my first meal was a dosa. So there you go, first impressions.
Samosas and dosas, sir.
Yes, yes.
Amidst of samosas and dosas, you met several different people and tribes of people. It's not one India, but then there are several colors that are inhabited in India. Where all you went ahead, and this trip has been since when?
I've been here for 2 weeks now, and I'm here primarily to visit the art festival, which will be this weekend in Delhi. I've been in Lucknow, in Varanasi, in Mangalore, and now in Noida. I wanted to experience Noida and New India, as well as Delhi and Old India, so I've been visiting both on this trip.
That's certainly great. So coming to your paper, which somewhere throws very important light on how India is looked by West.
Well, to be clear, I'm not trying to do some kind of cultural analysis of India, and I'm not here, it's been wonderful to meet people, but I'm not here to bring back my impressions of India. All of my work is based on data and documents. That is, what I'm looking for is an objective analysis of India to counter the very negative, subjective accounts that we've heard in the West. So I'm going to the actual statistics. Now, my recent paper that came out this week is on the International Religious Freedom Rankings. India has been named the worst country in the world, the worst, for social hostility to religion, meaning violence or discrimination on the basis of religion, by the Pew Research Center. And these reports are based on the data compiled by the United States State Department in its U.S. International Religious Freedom reports. Now, I found that extremely unlikely, that India is the most hostile country in the world to religion, when religion is so vibrant here in India. If any country is hostile to religion, it's where I live, in Australia or in the United Kingdom, certainly not here in India. So I got down to the numbers, and that's what my report is about, countering these subjective narratives with objective facts.
So when you're talking about the data metrics or data that you have showcased, if you can throw light on certain numbers, because yes, you are very much right, it's not a simple narrative, but then it is all about facts, the factual thing that you have put out on paper. And I'm trying to stress on this especially because you have already seen the kind of climate that is surrounding around India, the narrative that has been triggered against India.
So fortunately, when it comes to religion, we have very good factual data about freedom of religion and the freedom to practice religion in India. And it comes from the very same Pew Research Center that published the report that was anti-India. So a different division within the Pew Research Center had a survey done in India in 2019-2020, an absolutely first-class social survey, 29,999 households surveyed in 17 languages, nationally representative, and a response rate over 85%. I'm sorry to rattle off these numbers, but this really was a first-rate social survey, among the best that's ever been done in India. What they found was that 89% of India's Muslims and 89% of India's Christians say they are, quote, very free to practice their religion. Only 2% of each group say that they are unfree in some way to practice their religion. In other words, the number of people, the proportion of people in India among religious minorities who feel they face any pressure about their religion is vanishingly small, 2% or less. That doesn't correspond to the narrative we hear coming out of the West, which is that there is at any day going to be a genocide of Muslims in India. Yet when we ask actual Muslims in India, do you face discrimination? Are you free to practice your religion? Actual Muslims in India say they're doing just fine.
All of these facts and the line that you said that it's only 2% of Christians and the Muslims who say or who have a different opinion, but then otherwise maximum of them say that they are free
98% say they're free to practice their religion.
free to practice their religion.
89% say very free. They emphasize it. What's more than 90% of every major religious group, Hindu, Jain, Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, more than 90% say that to be Indian, it's fundamentally important to respect other people's religions. Okay? More than 90% in every group. Hindus respect Muslims practicing their religion, and Muslims respect Hindus practicing their religion. Even when it comes to religious discrimination, we have stats saying that 24% of Indian Muslims say at some point they've faced discrimination. Now, there's discrimination everywhere. Someone is always going to face some problem that they believe was due to religious discrimination. So we have to ask, is 24% a lot? Well, 72% of India's Muslims say they've never faced discrimination. What's more, if we look internationally, Pew asked this very same question in the United States. More than 80% of African Americans, 46% of Hispanic Americans, and 42% of Asian Americans say they face discrimination. In other words, Asian American discrimination in the United States is a worse problem than anti-Muslim or anti-Christian discrimination in India.
That's a very big statement, and I was about to come to that very particular point. This particular narrative that has been set up, the prejudice that has been inhibited in the minds of the people that comes from West, no offense out there, sir, but then this has been a very strong remarks that come from the West. When you talk about that it's fascism, one. Second, it's all injustice and violence that happens against the minorities over here in this very particular land where we are standing.
But these accounts don't originate in the West, they originate in India. We hear in the West from Indian human rights activists, from Indian columnists, from Indian social scientists, that the situation in India is grave, that there are serious problems of intercommunal violence and tensions in India. And we're simply repeating that back. We're simply repeating that back to India in these reports. These reports are not some kind of objective analysis being conducted. The US State Department is not sending fact-finding missions to India to find out what the situation on the ground is. Instead, we are getting complaints out of India that are then recorded by the US State Department and then feed into the Pew Research Center reports. Now, the person who wrote that Pew Research Center report saying India was the worst country in the world for freedom of religion, I don't want to dox anybody or name names, but has a South Asian name. The columnists who write about the lack of freedom in India, almost to a person, have South Asian names. Now, I can't tell what their citizenship is. Sometimes I can't tell whether they're Indian or Bangladeshi, but nonetheless, these narratives are coming from people with strong links to India. These narratives are not coming from Antony Blinken, right, US Secretary of State. If anything, the US State Department is very wary of these narratives and trying to not make too much of them. It's the Indians and Indian Americans and Bangladeshi Americans and Pakistani Americans who are really making this an issue.
Why this narrative you feel, sir, that has been put up? You talk about West, you talk about otherwise also, and Western media especially. I have seen this line somewhere from your write-ups only, that if there is something that is written in Wall Street of Journal, it is just considered as the factual thing.
Right. Because we have very little knowledge of India. There are probably about a half dozen Indian origin journalists and commentators who completely shape the Western narrative on India via articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Remember, when an American reads that article, a typical American is not looking, who wrote that article? Instead, they're just saying that article's in the Wall Street Journal, that article's in the Washington Post. They're not differentiating, and we can't really realistically expect them to differentiate. But because we live in such a data-poor environment about India, we know so little about India, one article in one of these major newspapers saying that India is no longer a democracy, or that in India Muslims face serious threats of genocide, one article like that has a massive influence in a way that an article about the United States doesn't have much influence for you. You know the United States, you follow its politics, you know the presidential candidates, you probably know a few governors, you may even know some senators and representatives, you may know the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense. So when you see an article about the United States, and they're out there, saying that the United States has become a fascist regime, you don't take it seriously. But when an American reads that India has become a fascist regime, why should they believe differently? They know nothing about India.
So, okay, so that gives an, a kind of statement that yes, they are not much aware about what India is and what is happening inside India. So, coming for two important topics. First, let me start with one, Mr. Soros. This very particular person, he suddenly comes and talks about one particular issue that is going within the country, and it's not only the ruling government but then also opposition who very categorically tell Mr. Soros to mind his own business, in other words, and to say that this is internal matter of India. It's opposition. If they have to raise something against the current ruling government, they will do so. But it has nothing to do with Mr. Soros.
Look, first, let's be honest. Being criticized by George Soros is electoral gold for Narendra Modi and the BJP. So, if anything, they're playing up this fact, not toning it down. George Soros is notorious for his being very outspoken about politics in developing countries in general. He takes very strong views that I think are often ill-informed about developing countries. He spends a lot of money attempting to shift political debates and political consciousness in developing countries. He's very strongly what you would call in India anti-national. That is, he's very much a liberal internationalist, and he promotes that agenda. Now, it's no surprise that a liberal internationalist like George Soros would be opposed to the current government of India. But if anything, the current government of India is going to make an advantage out of that criticism instead of really feeling, instead of really suffering from being criticized.
Okay. So, but then when such kind of, you talk about Mr. Soros or otherwise also, when such personalities or publications or other things come ahead and try commenting on different governments, different countries' government, how do you look at this particular whole narrative?
Look, there's really nothing wrong with commenting on other people's governance. That's what I'm doing. I mean, I'm studying Indian democracy and I'm commenting on Indian democracy, and I don't really think there's an issue with that. The issue is, first, if you're ill-informed, but second, if you are trying to influence as opposed to simply comment. When I present data and documents and information about Indian democracy, I'm presenting it to you, you make up your own mind, but I'm not trying to interfere in Indian politics. Of course, I don't have the resources for that. I'm not a mega billionaire who can spend money to support organizations that promote my point of view. What becomes dangerous with someone like George Soros is when, and Dr. Jaishankar used that very word, dangerous. What becomes dangerous is when Indians start to say, what would Mr. Soros fund? Instead of Indians saying what they want, and if Mr. Soros funds it, wonderful, if they start shifting their point of view in order to attract Soros funding. And unfortunately, Soros funding is on such a grand scale that there's a real potential for people to be ingenuine in order to simply attract his support.
BBC's documentary coming out and saying that they have done a massive research, and with the massive backdrop, they come out with a conclusion that how Muslims are completely ill-treated in India, and they also speak about the Godhra riots that happened in Gujarat.
Look, the BBC documentary exists for one reason and one reason only. That's the leaked Foreign Office report that was leaked to the BBC. That report was made in 2002. I think we have to ask, why was that report leaked now? I mean, no report, no documentary. There wasn't enough material in this documentary to justify its production without the leaked report. I think it's clear the report was leaked right around the time Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And I view this very much as an anti-Hindu leak against Mr. Sunak, not an anti-India leak against Mr. Modi. If the leak was made to target India or made to target Narendra Modi, it would have been made in 2014, it would have been made in 2019, or it would have been held for 2024. Whoever in the British Foreign Office wanted to get this report out decided to do it at exactly the same time. If you count back the weeks it would have taken to make the documentary, that person leaked it at exactly the time that Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister. And I strongly suspect this was driven by anti-Hinduism, not among everybody in the British Foreign Office, but among somebody in the British Foreign Office who simply wanted to embarrass Rishi Sunak.
So there is some kind of ill intention behind this very particular documentary, is what you come out and say. But then at the same time, sir, now that has happened, that has happened. Then there were raids over here in BBC. How do you look at it? People see that this is a counter reaction to freedom of expression that BBC went ahead and said.
Obviously, I can't know what the legal status is of those raids. I'll leave it to Indians and to Indian lawyers and Indian journalists to uncover that. It was certainly bad politics and certainly bad public diplomacy. If the Indian government wants to look good on the world stage, it should have accepted the criticism in the BBC documentary with equanimity and good grace. It should simply have said, we disagree with the documentary, but allowed it to be shown in India, and it should have certainly not have taken this is the very moment to initiate an investigation of the BBC. Now, for all I know, that investigation was pending and it just is coincidence. You Indian journalists have to uncover the truth behind the timing of this investigation. But from a public diplomacy standpoint, it certainly was a poor decision to investigate the BBC at exactly the moment when they're quashing a BBC documentary, preventing it being shown in India.
Well, yes. Very last thing, sir. How do you look at overall India as a country? And now from the West lens, we have heard a lot, we have absorbed a lot, but you are right now in the same land which has been criticized a lot at one extremist level. How do you look at it?
Look, India is a magnificent growth story, and in most of the West, India is being seen simply as a growth story. How can we get in on this fantastically growing economy, the $10 trillion economy of the 2030s? But from my perspective, it's much more interesting as a democracy story. That if we're looking for models of democracy that can be applied in the rest of the developing world, it's clear that American democracy, my own democracy, I'm American, does not export well to the developing world. We've seen it attempted to be exported to Afghanistan, attempted to be exported to Iraq, and we've seen the terrible consequences that's happened in both of those countries. I think the Indian model of democracy, by contrast, has real potential to be something that can be applied in the rest of the world. Indian democracy is very unlike American democracy. It's very much a democracy, but it's built on a different basis from American individualism. And so I'm interested in the idea of India as Vishwaguru, but not Vishwaguru in the sense that Mr. Modi uses it or that India uses it today, but as a democratic Vishwaguru, that India can hopefully teach other developing countries how to run a successful democracy in a country that is a post-colonial state with lots of internal divisions, with a GDP per capita of under $2,500 per year. Well, if India can do it, why can't Africa do it? Why can't Southeast Asia do it? Why can't West Asia do it? This model, I think, really can and should be exported to the rest of the developing world.
So, yes, because you are talking about the morals of the democracy. There are certain principles when we talk about the morals of democracy in my country. There has been this, I'm again and again, just trying to put it, because we have heard a lot about so much of criticism from all across, different countries. But now, there are 2-3 things that India is trying to portray itself.
Look, when I talk about India teaching the world, I don't mean about peace, I don't mean about disaster relief. That's fine, it's a good thing to do. I mean seriously that developing countries have not figured out how to run stable democratic institutions, except one developing country, India. And I think India should be sending experts abroad, teaching them how to run these institutions that are successful in India, whether it's the Supreme Court or the Electoral Commission of India, or in general the broad government, how state governance works in India. If you think about it, a state like Uttar Pradesh has the GDP per capita of Rwanda, yet Rwanda suffered genocide, strongman rule, stagnation. Uttar Pradesh, for all of its problems, is a relatively successful democratic state within India. So why can't the Chief Minister's office in Uttar Pradesh send technical experts to Rwanda in the same way the United States does? The United States has done democracy promotion for 100 years now. Can't India do the same? And that's what the book I'm working on is about. It's about, well, what can we draw as lessons from the Indian model of democracy to take to the rest of the world?